In the forgotten corridors of Europe's past, there is a legend no scholar dares to record, a secret whispered only by candlelight. They called themselves the Mourning Sisters, noblewomen draped in velvet gowns so heavy that no one questioned what moved beneath them. But hidden in those folds was no silk, no lace, only black, ravenous rats, waiting to punish any man whose eyes lingered too long. Some called it superstition, others a curse, yet the screams echo still, proof that beauty once carried teeth in the dark. This is a horrifying new tale from the author of The Shadow Glass, coming soon to a horror anthology series. It's a story about a plague doctor who falls in love with a woman only to discover her dark secret. He tries to warn her, but she won't listen. Out. And as the body count rises, he must confront the truth. Beauty is only skin deep, and sometimes it's best to stay away from the things that go bump in the night. Stay tuned for more terrifying tales. Oh, my little monsters, did you think your naughty eyes could get away with it? Did you truly believe you could stare your fill of those sweet young things and suffer no consequences? Fools, for they are the pupils of the serpent and the viper, and their hiss can turn your grand halls into a haunted house. In the hushed corridors of forgotten archives, there lies a story that polite historians never dared to write down. It speaks of a circle of noble women, not of crowns or jewels, but of whispers and shadows. They were known in veiled letters as the Mourning Sisters, a society of aristocratic women who in the dying glow of the 17th century practiced a punishment so strange, so grotesque, that even now the mere mention of it can leave one sleepless. Their chosen weapon was not the dagger, nor poison in a goblet, but something far more unsettling, a swarm of black rats. They kept hidden within the folds of their gowns.
Ow!
The tale begins in the courts of Central Europe, where men of high rank believed themselves untouchable. Balls, feasts, and grand hunts brought them together, and with them came the predatory glances cast upon the young women forced to attend. It was said that noble ladies were ornament, no more existing to be gazed upon, judged, and whispered about. But the Mourning Sisters were different. They wore gowns heavier than fashion demanded, skirts layered thick with velvet and lining, so cumbersome that servants sometimes wondered how they could even walk without stumbling. Few knew that beneath those folds stirred a hidden life. Cages. Compartments sewn into the very hems, where sleek black rats writhed and gnawed quietly in the dark. The sisters chose the rat for a reason. In those years, rats were symbols of plague, death, and sin. To unleash one upon a man was to curse him with humiliation, terror, and the suggestion of unclean spirits. Witnesses would later claim that a lady, when slighted by the wandering eyes of a lord or the drunken laugh of a knight, would step closer, her perfume sweet and distracting, and with a subtle motion of her hand, a gap in her gown would open. Out from the darkness would dart a rat fang sharp, claws scrabbling as if vomited forth by her very body. Men screamed, stumbled, fled. Some even swore they saw more than one, a swarm pouring out from silken skirts like a living curse. No court chronicler dared record such incidents openly, but letters from terrified scribes remain. One, dated 1682, speaks of a dinner at which the Duke of Moravia shrieked like a child. For from the lap of a veiled lady came forth a beast that ran across his plate, leaving filth upon the venison. Another recalls a banquet where an entire table overturned as noblemen scrambled to escape a scurrying black tide loosed without warning. The women sat still through it all, eyes calm, lips curled, and the faintest of smiles, as if the chaos were a private joke. Oh yes, they were quite the comedy, were they not? A jest at the expense of decorum, of societal norms, and most especially of men's fragile egos. For what is a nobleman but a peacock, strutting, preening, desperate for admiration? And what is admiration but the illusion of choice? These women gave them the gift of choice, the choice to look, to ogle, and then to suffer the consequences. How deliciously ironic. The worst, however, was reserved for those who tried to warn others, for those who dared speak of the rats. They, too, were silenced, not with a scream, but a whisper, the mere suggestion of madness. For who would believe that a woman could send forth a plague of vermin, that a lady's skirt could harbor such filth? And yet, oh my little monsters, do not doubt the evidence of your senses. Ever a lady's skirts brush against your leg? If ever you see a flash of teeth or a twitch of whiskers in the corner of your eye, do not hesitate to flee. Should anyone doubt your tale, you need only reply with a smile, for what is truth but a matter of perspective? And what is perspective but a rat's eye view of humanity? In the heart of a city famed for its silks and secrets, there existed an order of women known as the Mourning Sisters. Their reputation grew like a shroud, draping itself over the nobility and the elite, weaving tales of terror and vengeance. Some claimed they belonged to a secret order stretching back to the time of the Black Death, when women had first learned to harness the fear of vermin against those who thought themselves untouchable. Their gowns were rumored to be specially tailored by seamstresses who never lived long after their work was done. Tailors disappeared, laundresses vanished, leaving behind only fragments of testimony, bloodstains, torn fabric, the faint odor of decay, and always the scrawled symbol of a rat etched somewhere in the margins of their belongings. What truth lies beneath the legend is difficult to prove. But in portraits from that era, if one looks carefully, the clues remain. Women painted in silks too thick for summer, hymns suspiciously swollen, shadows painted darker near their feet. One day, a painter in Prague confessed in a drunken letter that he was ordered to paint a lady without showing the lump at her hip. She swore was moving beneath the fabric, as if something alive pressed it. His signature, shaky and blotted, was the last trace of him before his studio was found abandoned, his canvases slashed to ribbons. The sisters never spoke openly of their craft. To them, it was a language of vengeance understood only in silence. Their gatherings were held in candlelit rooms, shutters sealed tight, the sound of scratching beneath the table merging with the whispers of their oaths. Each new member, it is said, was forced to carry a rat against her skin during her first ball, its claws pricking her thigh, its breath hot and foul against her flesh. While she smiled as though nothing were amiss, only then was she truly considered one of them, bound by fear, by power, by the living darkness hidden beneath her gown. And so the legend of the Mourning Sisters spread like a sickness, whispered from servant to servant, from guard to stable boy. Men laughed in daylight, calling it superstition. Yet their eyes flickered nervously when women passed in velvet. For in the candlelight of the banquet halls, where shadows were long and music masked every sound, who could be certain that the swish of a skirt did not conceal a horde of tiny waiting teeth? Now, I am no scholar, nor do I make claims to have unearthed the whole truth behind these chilling chronicles. My own encounter with the tale began when a weathered book, its pages smelling faintly of mildew and regret, fell into my hands. Within its yellowed folds, I discovered a story that chilled me to the bone, yet compelled me to delve deeper. It spoke of a plague-ridden London, a city teeming with rats, where whispers arose of an insidious plot hatched by desperate women. They swore an oath of secrecy, bound by a shared trauma, a means to strike back at the aristocracy that had turned a blind eye to their suffering. It was a pact forged in the fires of desperation, its tendrils reaching into the very fabric of society, infecting the highest echelons of power. The story unfolded through fragmented accounts, each piece like a shard of glass reflecting a sliver of the truth. There were rumors of clandestine meetings in the dead of night, of hooded figures emerging from the shadows, of sudden, inexplicable deaths that shook the foundations of the ruling class. It was a narrative woven with such intricacy that it ensnared my curiosity, forcing me to peer through the cracks of history. As I delved deeper, I found myself navigating a labyrinth of half-forgotten lore. The Mourning Sisters became more than just a tale to me. They evolved into specters haunting the grand halls of the past. I saw them in the pallid faces of noblemen, felt their icy touch in the sudden chill of a summer night, heard their whispers in the rustling of old parchment. Yet with every step into the abyss of their mystery, I realized the true cost of their vengeance. For the Mourning Sisters, in their quest for retribution, became vessels of an unrelenting darkness, a force that consumed all in its path, leaving behind a legacy of fear and despair. This tale, once confined to the musty pages of an ancient book, now thrums within my own veins. I carry it like a torch, determined to illuminate the shadows where the Mourning Sisters once thrived. My journey is one of remembrance, of giving voice to the voiceless, and ensuring that the sins of the past are not buried, but brought to the light of day. The year is 1692. Rumors have been circulating about three mysterious ladies who appear at courtly balls in elaborate mourning clothes, veils, and gloves, creeping ever closer to the king and the queen. Some say the three ladies are sisters, others that they are not related. All agree, however, that they move as one, their rustling silks seeming to carry some unnatural menace. When the queen appears pale and wan at a party, clutching her throat and gasping for air, suspicion falls on the Mourning Sisters. Whispers turn to screams. People see the ladies fleeing the palace in a coach that waits at the end of a long avenue. But when police arrive, the coach is gone, and the driver claims never to have seen it. If the first whispers of the Mourning Sisters seemed like parlor tales to frighten drunk lords, the second wave of stories carved themselves deeper into memory because they came not from gossip, but from events that left scars, both on stone walls and on men's flesh. There was an incident in Krakow in the winter of 1687, recorded not in chronicles but in the confessions of a trembling servant girl. She swore that during a masked ball at the bishop's residence, one nobleman grew too bold, pressing his hand against a lady's waist beneath her heavy skirts. He expected to feel silk and pliant flesh. Instead, he felt movement, wet, squirming, clawing. Before he could cry out, a rat burst forth, biting into the back of his hand so deep that the bones of his knuckles shone through the torn skin. He staggered back screaming, mask askew, as the lady walked calmly on, her lips curled in a faint smile, her gown swaying as though nothing had happened. The bishop ordered silence. No record of the ball survives except for a blood-stained glove, preserved by the servant who dared not speak until her dying breath. The idea spread like a fever. The rats were not merely hidden pets, but instruments of ritual. It was whispered that the sisters did not simply trap vermin, they bred them. Black, sleek, larger than ordinary rats, with eyes like glass beads and teeth honed by strange diet. Some accounts insist the creatures were fed on spoiled wine and the marrow of lambs, trained in darkness until they obeyed the scent of perfume and the rustle of silk. One rumor claimed the sisters daubed their hems with honey or blood to lure the animals to the right place at the right moment, ensuring that when they loosed their terror, it was no accident but a deliberate strike. In Paris, a rumor grew around Lady Isabeau, whose gowns were said to be impossibly wide, their weight dragging across the marble floors with a hiss like dry leaves. She became infamous when, during a performance at the opera, a rat crawled out from beneath her chair and scuttled up the velvet curtain, causing a panic so great the theater emptied in chaos. Witnesses swore she never moved, her face serene, eyes fixed on the stage, as though she alone remained untouched by the madness. Later, when questioned, she claimed ignorance. What beast? I saw only shadows, she murmured, yet her smile chilled those who heard it. Within months, her portrait appeared in the salon of a fellow aristocrat. If one looks closely at the folds of her painted skirt, something darker than fabric seems to curl there, a shadow with claws. The very air they breathed turned to poison, for now doubt had taken root. Could such things exist? Were these creatures real or figment? Was the danger all in their heads? No man wished to test the theory. Sisterhood's existence became both denied and feared. Men would swear loudly in taverns that no such women existed, that it was only gossip invented by jealous courtiers. And yet, those same men lowered their eyes quickly in the presence of a heavily dressed lady, never letting their glance linger, lest a hidden punishment await. This paradox only strengthened the sisters' power. They did not need to act often. The idea of them was enough to haunt the minds of men. Every creak of floorboards beneath a sweeping hem, every flicker of shadow near a banquet table became a warning. And so the legend of the Mourning Sisters grew, becoming a touchstone for fear, a warning to all men that no matter how great their power or how carefully they concealed themselves, there were forces older and crueler than they were, and they were always watching, waiting for their moment to strike. Hi everyone, is your host. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the mini-series. We've got 2 more stories to go before we reach the conclusion of the series, so be sure to stay tuned if you don't want to miss them. Till then, here's another story from the series. There's a chill in the air, the smell of wood smoke, and something sickly sweet. You pull your cloak tighter around you as you hurry through the deserted streets. The buildings seem to lean towards you, their gables like gnarled fingers clutching at the night sky. Above, a gibbous moon casts long, distorted shadows that dance and writhe like phantoms. In the distance, flickering candlelight spills onto the cobbles, spilling into the darkness like spilled honey. You hesitate, then drawn by some unseen force, you step into the pool of light and push open the heavy oak door. Inside, a fire crackles merrily in the hearth, chasing away the damp chill. A group of men and women sit gathered around it, their faces animated, their voices hushed but eager. As you enter, they fall silent, turning to regard you with curious eyes. "More have come," one of the men says, his voice raspy with disuse. They bring news. Before you can reply, another woman speaks up, her tone sharp. "Are you sure we can trust them? The same ones who brought the rats?" The others murmur in agreement, their eyes narrowing. You hold up your hands in defense. "Swear it is true. I saw it with my own eyes. I felt it crawl across my skin. It's here. She's here. Among us." But not all men were content to live in fear. There were attempts to expose them, to tear open their gowns and prove the truth. In Vienna, a drunk baron supposedly lunged at a mourning sister during a feast, shouting that he would show the world her trick. He grasped at her skirts, but before he could rip the fabric, a rat sank its teeth into his wrist, and another into his thigh. In his thrashing, the baron overturned an entire table, wine and silver clattering to the floor. By the time servants pried him free, his body bore a dozen bites, festering with infection. He died within the week, muttering deliriously of the nest beneath her skin. The lady, unnamed in records, vanished from court the very next day, her carriage never seen again. What makes the legend more grotesque are the accounts that suggest the rats were more than punishment, they were sacrifices. Some fragments of letters preserved in private collections hint at rituals where the sisters gathered in candlelit chambers, their skirts moving with restless life. They would set the rats free in circles drawn with ash, whispering oaths as the creatures gnawed on scraps of bread soaked in blood. The rats, it was said, carried the women's anger, their vengeance, their silent curses. To release one upon a man was not only to shame him but to mark him with invisible rot, the kind that ate away at reputation and sanity. Those who crossed the sisters often reported dreams, afterward visions of claws scratching against their ribs, of being gnawed alive from within. Some took their own lives in desperation. Others vanished without trace, their names scrubbed from family records, as if they had never been born. Only fragments remain. A ring left on a table, a ledger with a name blotted out, a torn shoe found at the edge of a riverbank. Each was whispered to be the work of the Mourning Sisters' silent vengeance. There is one final piece of testimony from a physician in Prague who was called to treat a nobleman plagued by fevers. The man insisted he could hear rats beneath his bed, though none were ever found. On his deathbed, he whispered that one of the sisters had leaned close to him at a banquet weeks before, brushing his shoulder with her gown. "It was then I felt it," he told the doctor, "something living, pressing against me, crawling into me through her shadow." He died hours later, foam at his lips, eyes wide with terror, as though he saw something gnawing its way out of the dark corners of the room. The doctor burned his notes soon after, yet a single line survives in a copy. They carried death not in their hands, but in their hems. And so, the legend thickened like a fog over Europe. No man could be sure if the noblewoman smiling across the hall was merely adorned in silks, or if her every step carried the scratching of tiny claws, ready to punish the faintest flicker of a glance. What finally pressed rumor into the shape of history was not a scream in a ballroom, but a stack of papers that smelled of tallow and damp cedar. A packet of letters sealed with a red wax sigil, a rat's tail knotted into a noose. The chest that held them surfaced during the inventory of a ruined manor near Brno in 1691. When creditors picked the bones of a bankrupt house and filed their findings like undertakers. Inside, no manifestos, only a patient hand explaining how to stitch fear into cloth. Skirts were to be interlined with buckram. Hem channels left loose enough to breathe, yet tight enough to guide. Vents disguised as pleats, and a narrow silver mouth hidden where the palm could find it without looking. The notes were briskly practical: how to mask the rustle with watch chains, how to perfume the lining to cover the creature's musk, how to keep the fabric dry so claws would not slip until. The handwriting slowed and turned devotional. Choose the man who treats the room as a mirror, one line read. Stand between him and his reflection. Another explained why the sisters circled candles before a feast. The ritual is not for the rat. It is for the hand. A final letter addressed only to D answered doubt with weather. When the man flinches, the world remembers him as prey. When we stand, the world remembers us as weather. The signature was a flourish that might have been an A or a clause. The chest held one more object, a bodice boned with whalefin, its lining stained with a sweetness like rot hidden under roses. A narrow tube had been set along the sternum and stitched down into the skirt, ending in the silver mouth the notes described. Run a fingertip there and you could imagine a flautist coaxing a storm from silence. The clerk who catalogued it wrote divisive indecency, and then raked the quill across his own words until the page tore. He did not sleep much that winter. Those papers never reached a court, but they reached people, which is more dangerous. A copy was made by a priest who claimed he meant to condemn it. His marginalia are a war between disgust and fascination. Ignominy, he scribbled. Then a few lines later, ingenuity. A maidservant who read only the diagrams traced the hem channel by candlelight and laughed in sudden understanding. While her mother crossed herself twice and blew the flame out with shaking lips, the painter shone the bodice, followed its tubes with his eye, and began, without meaning to add thickness to his lady's skirts. A shadow upon a shadow that now seems obvious. When you stand before his portraits and notice the swell at the hip that refuses to be purely cloth. In a seaside town where the cliff face falls each spring, fisherman's wife spoke to a traveling scribbler and told him. The rats nested in mourning hymns and wore tiny scorches shaped like crosses in their eyes. He scoffed until he saw the bead marks along her wrists where a rosary had been pulled too hard in prayer. They do not hunt men, she said. They teach men to stop hunting. She drew a square of salt on the table and tapped one corner. This is the corner where a gaze turns mean. They know that corner by scent. An attempt was made to turn the sisters' precision against them. A magistrate in Olomouc set a dinner like a snare. 2 notorious gazers seated beside 3 women whose gowns fell in sober cascades of black. Under the table, he fixed a fine brass mesh to catch anything that fell. Behind latticework, he hid boys to watch for the telltale press of a hand at the hip. The boys saw nothing but rings catching candlelight. The mesh, however, had its own idea of justice. At the 3rd course, a draught licked the wicks, and shadow slid. A hiss went through the room like cloth on stone. The gazers turned their heads as one. The mesh rattled. 4 small shapes struck it at once and sprang back into darkness, not from the lady's skirts, but from the wainscot itself, drawn as the letters promised by warmth and perfume and the human instinct to peer. The gazers leaped, a tureen shattered, wine bled across linen, and no one could say where the creatures had come from. Only that the ladies rose without hurry and left, their hems untroubled, their hands clean. The boys behind the screen swore later that the only signal they saw all night was the magistrate's own glance. Moving like a hook from face to face, snagging where it pleased, he resigned within the month. The shadows in this room must be measured twice. So let us measure them now. From Vienna came a seamstress's confession in ink, the color of old plums. She had stitched hidden works for coin enough to buy her sister a dowry and the silence of 2 men. Employers required no questions and permitted no second tries. She wrote of a testing room floor swept bare, chalk lines coiled like a child's game. A single candle set at knee height, so the shadow would fling long and teach the eye to lie. They placed the rat at the silver mouth and showed it the chalk. If it balked or chose a corner, the hymn was unpicked and stitched again. They taught me to weigh thread with my breath, she wrote, to make a seam that moves when the heart moves. She fled after a laundress disappeared with a needle still pinned at her cuff, leaving only a smear of wax on the table in the shape of a tail. The seamstress hid with an aunt in the country and married a cobbler. Years later, when her first child died, she buried the confession under a kitchen flagstone. As if a story could be interred like a bone. We are struck by the plum-colored ink and the seamstress's nimble needle, but there is something stronger here, something that pulls the fabric of our attention. Do not mistake the rat for the punishment. The rat is the messenger. Punishment is the echo. Echoes breed in rooms we swear are silent. Rumor hardens into caution. A glance, once careless, learns to count to 3. But what exactly is being sown here? What work did the seamstress ply for these dark employers? We do not know, and yet we feel the pressure of it. Power the kind that cannot be taxed or tally travels in the folds of a dress the way a storm travels the mouth of a cave, unfelt until the instant it breaks. It is the unseen carriage of the powerful that makes the carefulness in the seams so vital. It is what the censors want to see effaced. A man in black enters the seamstress's chamber. Is he a spy? A suitor, perhaps? The description that follows reads like a ritual of accusation. First, his eyes, measuring the room, then his steps, measuring the space between himself and his hostess. Finally, he measures her face, not with his eyes, but with his fingers. His caress is a series of deliberate strokes, each one testing the boundaries of what can be touched without offense. She receives him as if such rituals were common between them. She has learned to read his eyes, the angles of his shoulders, the way his fingers curl against her cheek. The balance of power shifts subtly. She is still in charge of her own skin. She does not flinch from his touch, but she also does not allow him access to the forbidden parts of herself. When he leans in too close, she pulls away, saying only her lips are for sale, not the rest of her. But someone else has seen the meeting, and rumor, like a spiteful seam, begins to stitch its way through the town. A countess in black, the widow of a powerful baron, has been seen with a spy. They say he measured her with his eyes and found her wanting. Or perhaps, and this is darker still, they say the spy was measured by her and found wanting. Will believe the lady of the house when she swears she saw nothing more than a business transaction between a gentleman and a widow. There are other witnesses to the story, a serving girl and an old woman in the marketplace. Both have seen the gentleman in question and agree he looks like a spy. Their certainty ripples outward, and soon no one dares look at the countess or the widow. That is, no one dares look at them for more than a fleeting moment, for a glance once careless learns to count to 3. We hear stories like this and wonder why they mattered then, but not now. Why are these whispers of paranoia and fear not part of our modern discourse? Because they always were. This is the inheritance we receive from those who lived before us. The knowledge that power is most dangerous when it hides in plain sight. And those who try to wield it responsibly often find themselves suspected of wielding it irresponsibly. The burden of proof falls on the innocent, and yet suspicion clings to them like a shroud. This is the legacy of the past, the unanswered question of motive, the presumption of guilt, and the unshakable belief that appearances are everything. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Mourning Sisters had become less a circle of women than a cloud of dread that hovered over courts from Vienna to Paris. Men who had once laughed at the thought of vermin scuttling under velvet now lowered their eyes like schoolboys, yet it was not fear of scratches or bites that silenced them. It was the conviction that the sisters had become keepers of something older, a secret written not in ink, but in scratches on wood and in whispers behind locked doors. Their punishment, it seemed, no longer required the living rat at all. The animal was merely the first mask, the first silhouette. What lingered was far more enduring, the echo of unseen teeth. There is a diary, attributed to a countess in Saxony, that speaks of the final gathering she attended before her sudden retirement from court. She described a cellar lit with 20 candles, their wax running in rivers across the floor. Each sister stood in her heavy gown, hymns brushing the ground with faint, restless sounds. Yet when the countess looked closely, she saw no movement beneath the cloth. Instead, she heard it in her head scratching, chewing, the endless gnaw of something eating at wood and bone. The others recited words she did not recognize, words that seemed older than the Latin of her prayers. It was then, she wrote, that I knew the rat was no longer flesh, but a shadow that lived in us all, a punishment carried by silence. She burned her gown the next morning and never returned. Her entry ends mid-sentence, the ink blurred by a drip of wax shaped like a tail. What followed was stranger still, a century of absence. Portraits of noblewomen grew lighter, skirts narrowed, hems lifted clear of the floor. It was as though fashion itself had conspired to erase the sisters, to strip away the folds where shadows might nest. Historians declared the tales superstition, dismissing the diaries and letters as inventions of frightened servants. And yet every few decades, a story surfaced, always whispered, always quickly buried. In Madrid, a painter vanished after claiming his sitter's skirts moved of their own accord. In Venice, a merchant was found drowned, his face gnawed though no rat was seen aboard the gondola. In London, a tailor hung himself from his shears, leaving behind a note, "The hymn is never empty." And so the legend faded, becoming a half-remembered nightmare. A chill at the nape of the neck when silk skirts brushed too close. Until one day, in the late 19th century, a young woman stepped out of her carriage in Milan and into the arms of the waiting press. Her name was Isabella, and she was the last of the Mourning Sisters. How she escaped the sisters, how she defied the whispers and the gnawing silence, no one knew. But the world was changed. No longer were rats seen as familiars of the damned, nor were they banished from the sight of polite society. On the contrary, they were everywhere, scampering through the newly illuminated streets, feasting on scraps and overflowing bins, finding haven in the warmth of crowded rooms. And she welcomed them. When the sisters gathered in her Milanese salon, they did not come to curse the creeping things. They came to listen. For Isabella had learned the language of rats. She understood their hunger, their quick darting eyes, the frantic scratching of claws on wood. She fed them, and she listened. And what the rats told her was not of gnawed bones and devoured hearts, but of a different terror lurking in the city's heart. A darkness older than the sisters themselves, something that stirred in the sewers, seeking not food, but blood. And though the men had long ago forgotten the taste of terror, they would remember soon enough, for Isabella was about to show them. That was the night the Carnival of Flesh began. Drawing by Anna Sudgen. Isn't it beautiful? I love the way she captures the melancholy of the piece. Check out her other work. You can find her on social media. And thank you for listening. These scattered fragments formed a pattern only if one dared to look. Wherever men treated women as objects to be stared at, the Mourning Sisters returned, not in flesh, but in rumor. A presence as intangible as perfume and as stubborn as plague. They became less a society and more a law, one unrecorded yet obeyed. The punishment was no longer the release of a rat at a feast, but the weight of imagination itself. To know the sisters existed, Evan, if only as legend, was to restrain the eyes. To break the habit of treating every woman as spectacle, fear became a leash, invisible yet strong. Some say the sisters survive still, not in noble halls but in forgotten corners of cities, in theaters where curtains rustle without wind, in trains where a shadow darts between passengers' feet. A historian in Prague once confessed he could not enter an archive at night, for he swore he heard claws skittering across the shelves whenever he read of them. A modern seamstress in Vienna told of receiving a commission for a gown so heavy she could barely lift it, with instructions to sew hidden channels in the lining. When she delivered it, the client smiled and whispered, "Do not worry. The animal has already chosen me." Whether these accounts are inventions or echoes hardly matters now. Legends are not measured by evidence, but by the marks they leave on behavior. And the mark of the Mourning Sisters endures. Even now, centuries later, men cross their legs nervously when a woman in dark velvet passes, though they could not tell you why. Even now, in old estates where wardrobes stand closed, the wood is often found gnawed from within, as though something waited there, patient and hungry. And even now, when a man lingers too long with his eyes upon what he should not, he may feel a tickle at his ankle, a whisper of claws along the floorboards, and remember the lesson taught by skirts heavy with silence. For the true terror of the Mourning Sisters is not the rat itself, but the knowledge it planted. That punishment can come from the smallest of creatures, carried unseen in the folds of beauty, released at the moment you believe yourself safe. The sisters needed no armies, no blades, no decrees. They needed only rumor, silence, and the gnawing certainty that somewhere, in the velvet darkness beneath a hem, justice still waits, small, black, and hungry.
Ow.
They came from nothing and nowhere, these women of the Black Shroud. Yet their influence bloomed like a miasma, taking hold in the very marrow of a city. There were no records of their beginning, only the slow, sure accumulation of sightings, always the same. In the waning days of summer, when the sun was a shriveled grape upon the vine, a chill wind would stir, rustling through the streets like a living thing, and then they would appear, walking silently in a procession, as endless as a nightmare. Cloaked figures with visages hidden beneath hoods, they were always accompanied by a clacking sound, like the fall of hail or the snapping of twigs. And whatever followed that sound withered and died. No man was safe, not in the highest tower, nor the deepest vault, not while those specters walked. Then, nowhere were they more feared than in the great halls of the nobility. For it was there the veil between the worlds grew thin, and the whispers of the dead could be heard. Sometimes the women stopped before a window and tapped with gnarled fingers, and those who looked out saw only the reflection of their own startled face staring back. Other times they glided through solid walls, leaving scorch marks like lightning in the stone. Once inside, they sought out men alone in the darkness, and those who encountered them never emerged again from the shadowed rooms. No priest could turn them back, no holy water halt their progress, for they were guided by an ancient hunger that defied the prayers of the living. Men tried to fight them off, but weapons shattered against the touch of those spectral fingers. And even as they fell, they heard the echo of that relentless clicking growing ever louder until their own blood ran cold. Then in the end, only silence remained, and the women of the black shroud vanished as suddenly as they had come, leaving behind only the faint scent of mildew and mortality. And yet, just as surely as spring follows winter, so did they return year after year. Summoned by some nameless dread that tightened its icy grip around the city's heart, people spoke of them only in hushed tones, knowing that acknowledgement invited their ghastly presence. Still, the sightings continued, persistent as rot, and fear turned to folklore. In time, scholars recorded tales of the gaunt women of the Black Shroud, tracing patterns in the chaos, searching for meaning amidst the madness. But even they could not hope to comprehend a horror that defied definition, that thrived on nameless dread and fed on unhallowed ground. So the legends grew and twisted, taking on a life of their own. And with each retelling, the women of the Black Shroud took on new horrors, becoming less human and more nightmare.